my next task is to introduce our dynamic first panel here. And I'll introduce them, starting with your immediate right and to my left. We have Brooke Mascagni. Did I pronounce that right? And she is a PhD candidate in political science and feminist studies at the University of California, Santa Barbara, Golden Country. Ms. Mascagni's doctoral work focuses on Prohibition 19, California's recent electoral initiative to tax and to regulate cannabis. Surprisingly, some of the greatest opposition to full legalization comes from members of the medical marijuana industry, who argue that state initiatives like Proposition 19 pose a threat to patients' already tenuous access to their medicine. Ms. Mascagni will discuss how centering the legalization debate around the patients has marginalized the issue of racial justice. In her study, she suggests that the tendency to draw a line between recreational and medical marijuana undermines the greater movement to end the unjust, capital W, war on capital D drugs. We look forward to your remarks. Next is Jordan Blair Woods, a PhD candidate at Cambridge University, that's the UK, a JD University of California, Los Angeles. Dr. Woods' research, Dr. Woods, please sing, but Mr. Woods' research centers on what the United States can take from the current developments in drug policy reform within Europe, following Portugal's decriminalization of drugs. He will explain Portugal's decriminalization model and present the empirical evidence of its effectiveness, discuss why the model will or will not work in other European countries, and will also discuss what the United States can learn from Portugal's model and the current discussion in Europe. And finally, to your far left, is Eric Sterling. Mr. Sterling is on the advisory board member of the Law Enforcement Against Prohibition, otherwise called LEAP, president of the Criminal Justice Policy Foundation. Mr. Sterling was a counselor to the House of Representatives Committee on the Judiciary from 1979 until 1989. On the staff of the Subcommittee on Crime, he was responsible for drug enforcement, amongst other things. He was a principal aide in developing the Comprehensive Crime Control Act of 1984 and the Anti-Drug Abuse Acts of 1986 and 1988. In the 96 Congress, he worked on comprehensively rewriting the federal criminal code. So, we'll begin with you, Ms. Mascagni, and your presentation on the California experience with drug reform. Would you like to stand or speak from the seat? Both mics are live.
Sure. How about from here? Is that
sure, that's quite all right.
Is this on?
It's live.
Okay. So, thank you for having me. As he said, I am my doctoral research does focus on Prop 19, which was the movement to legalize marijuana for all adults in California. It did not pass. But I have been following the movement for the past year, traveling all over the state, interviewing law enforcement, medical marijuana growers and dispensary owners, as well as leaders of major drug reform organizations. My interest in the movement has stemmed from, of course. Oh, really?
Just draw this on, but just draw a little closer to you.
This close?
Yes.
Okay. Sorry about that. Anyway, ending the war on drugs, right? What this conference is all about. But I have found that the California marijuana legalization debate has been centered around the rights of medical marijuana patients. The main argument that I'm proposing here is that ending marijuana prohibition would be better served by evoking outrage at the systematic racism of the U.S. criminal justice system instead of encouraging compassion, which often turns into pity for medical marijuana patients. And this is a bit of a controversial argument in the state of California, where medical marijuana has been such a huge issue, especially since 1996 with the passage of Prohibition 215. In my initial stages of research, I had actually thought that in the months leading up to the election, we would observe the strategic use of fear, such as in the reefer madness tradition, from the religious right and other organizations. In California's 2008 Prop 8 campaign, which is the anti-gay marriage initiative, the Mormon Church and the religious right bombarded the airwaves with fear tactics, suggesting scenarios that gay teachers are going to make children gay. I also thought that maybe we'd see war on drug commercials that I grew up with, suggesting that my brain was an egg, that frying an egg in a skillet is equivalent to my brain on drugs. But to my surprise, we didn't see that at all. Actually, influential conservatives such as Sarah Palin and Glenn Beck endorsed the legalization of marijuana, arguing that prosecuting petty marijuana offenses is a waste of taxpayers' money. So instead, some of the greatest opposition has actually been coming from the medical marijuana community. Marijuana reform advocates have expressed reluctance to endorse legalization because it could possibly compromise the gains made in 1996, which grants marijuana access to patients. So in doing so, these advocates have essentially isolated themselves from the greater war on drugs by drawing what I consider an artificial line between marijuana for medical use and marijuana for recreational use. The medical marijuana is, the entire industry is committed to a politics of exclusion. One has to be a card-carrying member to enjoy the privileges of affordable access to marijuana without the fear of being criminalized by the U.S. government and state governments as well. In general, advocates of marijuana reform have goals of changing cultural norms regarding how Americans think about marijuana use. DEA still categorizes marijuana as a Schedule I narcotic, which is considered the most dangerous and to have no medicinal value. 2006, the FDA declared that no scientific studies support the medical use of marijuana. Yet at the state and local levels, medical marijuana activists have been extremely successful in convincing the public of the medicinal benefits of marijuana. Since 1996, it's now 15 states plus DC have passed some form of medical marijuana law. And we're bound to see quite a few more in the 2012 elections. What I'm most interested in is how activists in the medical marijuana industry have persuaded voters to protect patients' rights. Like I said before, 15 years ago, medical marijuana activists in California successfully passed the Compassionate Use Act of 1996. By evoking compassion for patients, particularly individuals diagnosed with AIDS, cancer, glaucoma, medical marijuana organizers have successfully convinced voters of the many ways that cannabis can treat the critically ill. And there's no doubt in my mind of the validity of these claims, right? There are numerous scientific studies on this. I've talked to patients and doctors, attended conferences on the valuable medicinal uses of marijuana. And today, a super majority of Americans support the use of marijuana for medicinal purposes. But in the contemporary debate today, this very same rhetoric of protecting the patients is still being utilized. And what's important to my argument is that evoking compassion for patients' rights has superseded evoking outrage at the unjust racial disparities perpetuated by the war on drugs. I've observed that the very category of the patient has been constructed in the social imaginary as an exclusive group of people, usually adults with very critical illnesses. And I know I do not want to challenge individuals who fit this description and rightfully deserve their safe and affordable access to their medicine. But in reality, in the state of California, it's simply not that cumbersome to obtain a doctor's recommendation for marijuana. One can get one for as cheap as $99 a year. There are numerous conditions that can qualify for a doctor's recommendation. On the one end, of course, you have AIDS and cancer and very serious terminal illnesses. You can also get one for joint pain, sleep disorders, anxiety, and stress. So medical marijuana organizers are perpetuating the illusion that patients are a specific category of people with serious medical conditions that deserve pity from the public and from policymakers. Indeed, drawing this artificial line for marijuana for medicinal use and marijuana for recreational use, I believe is more of a political strategy than an actual concern for public health. Throughout the Proposition 19 campaign, and presently leading up to the 2012 elections, where there'll definitely be an initiative on the California ballot, the executive director of Americans for Safe Access has cautioned the legalization campaign not to piggyback on the medical marijuana's already success. And of course, some of these concerns are quite legitimate. If Proposition 19 or any other legalization movement passes in California, clearly the federal government is going to be moving in, and I'm sure chaos will be erupting. I do, though, question prioritizing the rights of an exclusive group of people. The reality is that the line between people who need marijuana and who use marijuana is quite blurred. I have a story of a good friend of mine who is in her last stage 4 cancer. She lives in Portland, and lately a lot of people have been saying, you know what, offering marijuana, you should use medicinal marijuana, right? Even though oftentimes marijuana is considered a taboo recreationally. And the irony is if she does sit down and smoke a joint with her husband late at night, relaxing, watching a comedy, as a form of escapism from these horrible life conditions, can we really say that this is medicinal use of marijuana? Or is it recreational? Is it both? Is it just smoking pot? And so when we look at this issue through a critical feminist lens, this language of protecting the patients is illusionary. I believe it's gendered and it's ageist, meaning it's biased in favor of older adults. Because it evokes dependence and pity for an exclusive group of people. Political theorist Elizabeth Spellman, who I use a lot in my research, she's done an analysis of writings of Hannah Arendt, who's a political theorist, and Harriet Jacobs. They both use compassion in their writings. Hannah Arendt argues that discourses involving compassion, which often turn into pity, reinforce differences between the sufferer, so in this case the patient, and the non-sufferer, so the public. The creation of differences results in this insider-outsider relationship, which can prevent coalition building in greater movements for social justice. Arendt therefore argues that rhetorical devices evoking compassion and pity simply do not even believe in political discourses. And in her analysis of Harriet Jacobs' memoir as The Life of a Slave, Spellman argues that the genius of Harriet Jacobs' writing in 1861 is her ability to provoke outrage at the violent and inhumane behavior of slave owners, as opposed to prioritizing compassion for slaves. So if we apply this logic to the marijuana legalization debate, I believe that prohibition would be better served to evoke outrage at the systematic racism of the US criminal justice system, as opposed to encouraging pity for patients. While Arendt opposes pity, she does praise solidarity in public spaces, suggesting that public discourses should focus on our shared humanity rather than a strategy of pity for the sick. Of course, this is, I'm treading in controversial waters here, but it does highlight the powerful role that emotion operates in our political lives. And right now, in this contemporary discourse, there's a lot of movement organizing going on in California right now, prepping for 2012. At conferences, many of the movement organizers are saying we all need to work together. We need to build a strong coalition. But in the same breath, all these speakers are saying we need to secure patients' access first. And it seems that these movement organizers feel compelled to engage in this type of rhetoric because it works. It's worked in the past, and it's working now. But what troubles me, again, is by focusing on this issue, the goal of racial justice completely gets lost in the debate. And, you know, obviously many argue, I'm sure many in this room, that prohibition is not about the right to smoke pot, it's about social control. And the US government is truly not engaged on a war on drugs, it's engaged on a war on people. Predominantly those poor people who have largely been abandoned by the federal government. And all this being said, I'm not saying that some anti-prohibition activists in California have not tried to bring the issue of racial justice to the debate. Stephen Gutwig of the DPA has spoken at length about the systematic racism of marijuana prohibition. Researchers have found that young Black and Latino males are disproportionately targeted for marijuana offenses, despite evidence that whites consume marijuana at much higher rates than Black and Latinos. Also, I've heard Dorothy Small of Break the Chains and members of...
Deborah Small. That's right.
Oh, that's right, sorry. Deborah Small. And members of LEAF, like today. They've spoken on the importance of ending the criminalization of nonviolent drug offenders. Dr. Harry Levine with Queens College has repeatedly argued that it's a fallacy to assume that marijuana offenses are only a tiny fraction of the injustices suffered in the war on drugs. Low-level marijuana offenses have serious consequences. Once an individual is placed in the criminal justice system, he becomes what Levine calls a second-class citizen in the eyes of the government. Possession of just a very small amount of marijuana can disqualify persons from government assistance programs, such as public housing and federal student loans. The DPA has also shown that a kid who has been placed under the supervision of the criminal justice system has a far greater chance of future imprisonment. Despite all this overwhelming evidence, the marijuana reform movement in California has sidelined the issue of racial justice. And in all the interviews that I have conducted and in all of the conferences I have attended in the past year, I have observed that this patient rhetoric primarily comes from a place of white and class privilege. It is very rare to hear a member of a racial minority prioritize this rhetoric of protecting the patients. Research produced by criminal justice scholars have long established that the operation of a prison industrial complex unfairly targets minorities in this country. though many medical marijuana activists seem very disconnected from this issue. Feminist scholar Peggy McIntosh is well known for describing the societal benefits of whiteness as this invisible backpack of privilege, meaning that many white people do not realize the systematic privileges of what it means to be born white in this country. Hence, it's invisible. So it seems from my observations that the medical marijuana organizers carry around this backpack of white privilege, prioritizing the social construction of this category of patient over blacks and Latinos. Theorizing this way about white privilege does not suggest that opposition from the medical marijuana community is completely disingenuous. Many activists from the medical marijuana community, such as the ASA, believe that their effort to protect patients is an altruistic goal. But they have framed this debate from a privileged position. Indeed, the absence of a national or state registry on medical marijuana patients results in confusion regarding the actual social location of the patients. I mean, the identities of these are under lock and key because it's still a federal crime. So social identity markers such as race and ethnicity, sexuality, age, gender, ability are largely unknown. So while the public is led to believe that patients are primarily critically older, very sick people, this construction of the patient lacks a race or ethnicity. So the goal of protecting the patients is constructed through a colorblind lens, which ignores the harmful ways that race and ethnicity create inequality in this country. Today, in this post-contemporary civil rights era, many critical race scholars suggest that white supremacy has been repackaged as colorblind. This so-called new racism allows people who benefit from white privilege to passively ignore racial justice without engaging in the blatant discrimination that we used to see. Sociologist Michelle Brown argues that the U.S. public's knowledge of persons targeted by the criminal justice system is socially constructed from a distance. So this distant citizen is likely to prioritize the needs of patients as opposed to poor racial and ethnic minorities. Therefore, again, we're hearing this language of pity instead of outrage at the unjust system. And so, in conclusion, legalization organizers in the state are going to fail in outreaching to racial and ethnic minority communities for 2012 if they continually engage in this type of colorblind debate. I have observed already a lack of outreach, and this has come up in the conferences. Where are the members representing the NAACP and Latino organizations? The prohibition, anti-prohibition movement can only succeed by building a strong coalition across racial and ethnic boundaries. Again, prioritizing the rights of the patients neglects the interests of poor Black and Latino communities hit hardest by the criminal justice system. And so I suggest for future initiatives, particularly in 2012, we should fight for the rights and dignity of all human beings. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mascagni, for that very provocative thesis that sympathy for medical marijuana has superseded the outrage of the failed policies of criminalization of drugs. And the line between medical and general use is often blurred. And if I understood your thesis fully, it also ignores the greatest and one of the most disproportionate impacts of our war on drugs on poor people and people of color, particularly in terms of law enforcement.
And speaking of law enforcement, I would like now to transcend to Eric Sterling with his very vast background, both inside of the government and setting policy in the House of Representatives at least, and on the Judiciary Committee and on the Subcommittee on Crime, to his also advisory role with law enforcement against prohibition. I've been to a number of drug conferences, and it's always very interesting to see a high sheriff, shall we say, from the Midwest, with his full uniform type on and his big 10-gallon hat, talking about the failure of the war on drugs. Or to see law enforcement officers, sometimes dressed in their uniform, at a conference against our drug policies, talking from the inside of their law enforcement role on how our drug prohibition policies and our war on drugs are a failure. If that's not a testament of from the inside to a critical analysis on our problem with enforcing drug laws.
Professor Brooke, thank you very, very much. And good morning, everyone. I want to thank the board and the members of the Law Review for inviting me to speak at the David Clark School of Law. I knew David Clark. He was an outstanding lawyer and an activist. He was a terrific advocate against the death penalty where I worked with him, and he was an outstanding member of the council here in the District of Columbia. I used to live here in DC, and I testified before the council a number of times on drug policy matters. Perhaps at lunch or a break, I'll tell you the story. About 21 years ago, I was named to the Mayor's Advisory Committee on Drug Abuse. About 3 weeks later, the mayor had his very famous rendezvous with the FBI at the Vista Hotel. And I was quite the butt of jokes about being the mayor's advisor on drug abuse for that year. I want to commend the University of District of Columbia. In the 1990s, their faculty senate led the Safe Streets project here in the District of Columbia at a time when homicide was a major public health problem and had everybody in every ward of the city disturbed. And it was the leadership of faculty at UDC to try to bring together people to look at real solutions. We were able to work with sociology students. We funded an investigation. UDC students went to all of the drug treatment programs here that had contracts with the District of Columbia, found numerous ones which were frauds. Nobody was there, nobody at the address, and yet these were contracts that the Substance Abuse Treatment Agency had extended. And this in some way might help explain why the substance abuse problem is serious in the District of Columbia as it is. This morning I'm representing law enforcement against prohibition, as Professor Britton said, and membership is open to anyone, and I have membership blanks on the sign-up table, but it is the speakers who've worked in law enforcement who, as opposed to the ordinary membership that have asked me to speak today. I'd like to, by the way, thank this morning for assistance in my research, Elizabeth Fuji, and accompanying me on PowerPoint projector is Irina Alexander, recent graduate in criminology and criminal justice at the University of Maryland. She's going to be helping me in the visual side of this duet. And she is the chair of the National Board of Directors of Students for Sensible Drug Policy. Drug policy is often discussed as though it's sort of entirely independent of the rest of society. Someone will notice that substance abuse has gone up or gone down, and if it's gone down, well, the Drug Enforcement Administration and the drug czar will say, well, that's our policy work. We were cracking down, we were getting tough. And this, of course, is wrong, because drug use is a social phenomenon and exists entirely within social contexts. Drug abusiologists, usually claim that drug abuse is simply the inevitable result of exposure to drug use and a direct response to its availability. And yet, when you look at high school students, and we'll look at this data later more specifically, drug use goes up, it goes down, and yet almost steadily high school seniors have been reporting since 1975 that drug use is marijuana in particular I'm talking about, I beg your pardon, marijuana is very available. And now 4 out of 5 high school seniors say marijuana is easily available. And this is not fundamentally different than what we've seen for 30 years. So it's not simply availability or exposure that drives whether or not people use drugs. A second key thing is that drug abusologists like to misconstrue the difference between drug use and drug abuse. They see these as really inseparable terms. And that, of course, is aside from an abusive language, it's a very unhelpful way to think about this phenomenon in society. People use drugs for medical purposes, as we've heard. People use drugs for spiritual purposes, as I'll get to later. People use drugs for social purposes, and people do get into trouble with them. And the people who get into trouble with them, what we might call drug abuse, are often people who have very serious underlying problems. They have been victimized in their families. They have untreated mental illness. They've been abandoned or neglected. Perhaps a factor may involve their genetics or their family history. And to simply say that drug use and drug abuse is the same, is a very serious conceptual mistake. What I'm going to hope to do, I hope at the end of this, is to make an argument for what I call integrated control of drugs. As Professor Britton said at the outset, drugs are not controlled by the criminal law. They're not kept out of schools by zero-tolerance threats and punishment. Drugs are embedded in the society. They have important benefits for enhancing pleasure, providing relaxation, and for enhancing performance, for changing mood, for assisting in intimate connections. And we have to stop talking exclusively about risks, harms, and dangers. To talk that way is to talk nonsense, and to ignore the experience of tens of millions of people who use drugs. So we need a regime of controls that integrates drug users, drug abusers, drug producers, drug sellers into our society, into our culture, into our healthcare system, into our educational system, into our economy, and of course, into our system of laws. Families, teachers can't teach children about drugs in a society and cultural regime that habitually lies about drugs. Children cannot learn about drugs when federal drug-free school law provides that only propaganda may be taught to them. As long as drugs are illegal, how can a teacher talk to a student honestly about his or her own experience with drugs? How can a parent do the same? They are stripped of the power of authenticity in discussing what is dangerous and can't tell stories from their own experience. Doctors can't treat patients if they fear that their patients are undercover agents coming to investigate them. What's legally dangerous for doctors and patients to be truthful with each other, healthcare suffers. Right now under Prohibition we have an initiative called harm reduction, which is sort of a boutique little add-on to the healthcare system where we attempt to provide interventions such as sterile syringes to injecting drug addicts. My cousin Clifford was an injecting drug addict back in the early 1970s when I and my peers were all extensively using drugs and experimenting with many others. Clifford was about 4 or 5 years younger than I am and probably was sharing drugs and acquired hepatitis C. Like the overwhelming majority of drug users, he had a normal life. He was married to a wonderful wife. He had a rewarding job at Columbia University. As part of a loving family. But because of the hepatitis C that he got as a consequence of sterile syringes being contraband under our drug laws, he passed away about a dozen years ago. My cousin is an example of how our drug laws are not protecting people. And it brings me then to the question of what should be the goal of our drug policy? Anybody have a suggestion of what the primary goal of our drug policy should be?
Public health.
And what does that mean? The primary goal should be to save lives, First, we want to save lives. And whose lives are we trying to save? The lives of drug users. The primary goal of drug policy should be to save the lives of drug users. The goal of drug policy should be to protect drug users. And yet we have a drug policy that in fact is utterly indifferent to the life of drug users and completely devalues them. I'd like to go to the slides of data that I have. I'd like first to look at the rate of deaths in the United States from unintentional drug use, drug overdoses. You can see here that between about 1971, the rate per 100,000 of deaths from overdoses was about 1.1, 1.2. And by 2007, it's up to almost 9 per 100,000. So that the death rate is increased by 800% over this period of time. You can see that the death rate has gone up steadily from drug overdose death. What kind of drug, if this is the outcome, at what point does the government say, enough? At what point does the public say, enough? I'd like to look now at the slide on drug use. You know, of course, before we get to that, we should mention that in our activity, our war on drugs in Mexico has now, since President Calderon started his intense action against the drug trafficking organization there, on the order of 36,000 people have already been killed, 31,000 execution style. Now, in terms of drug use, how extensive is drug use in the United States? Okay, so this is number of current drug users. In rough terms, you can see that in total, we're talking stable since 2002, about 20 million users per month of illicit drugs. Relatively stable, greater than this has been for many years, except for the high point of the epidemic in 1979. What about youth? Do we have a slide for youth? Because in the case, let's see. These are, okay, we don't have a slide for youth. What we do have, if you go back to the slide for Europeans, you'll see that, looking over here, the United States would be, well, I don't have it, these are rates, and I didn't present the rates, but you can see from Greece to the left to the United Kingdom on the right, a wide range across Europe of what rates are in the use of drugs, population age 15 to 64. Sweden here in the middle, which has one of the toughest laws, right in the middle. Germany, which has a constitutional decriminalization, very, very low. UK has experimented. They have a high rate, but that's all very much tied in with very heavy alcohol use culture. In terms of high school students, adolescent use was 3.4 million in 1979 in monthly use. From 1988 to 1994, it ranged between 700,000 to 1.3 million monthly users. Since 1997, the number of adolescent marijuana users has been in the range of 1.7 to 2.1 million users per month. So, and then in the most recent, the last 4 years, it's been narrowly about 1.7 million users. So, a lot, a certain amount of stability. Right now, it is sort of in the middle of, or to the low side of where it's been since 1997. Remarkably steady pattern. Yet every time there is the most minuscule uptick, you'll hear, speeches from the White House saying this is due to medical marijuana, for example. This is the most recent data that came out showed a slight fraction of an increase. And Gil Kurlikowski, the White House drug czar, said this has got to be due to medical marijuana. But of course, when you think about this data, we've had medical marijuana debates, going back to the 1980s. When Reagan was president, the federal government distributed 800,000 marijuana cigarettes for human consumption in research projects. There were hearings held all over the country by DEA in a lawsuit dealing with medical marijuana. and teenage marijuana use went down throughout that period. There's no relationship between medical marijuana and teenage marijuana use, except in the minds of drug abusiologists like the drugs are. In talking about the context, one of the things when I worked on Capitol Hill, we often, would say things like, well, drugs and crime. I mean, drugs and crime are sort of like peanut butter and jelly. Drugs and crime, peanut butter and jelly, drugs and crime. Crime and drugs. These, this association is real in a certain sense because of the economics involved in the substance abuse, because of the economics involved with prohibition. All of the business transactions, and how many of the law students in here hope to go into some aspect of commercial law? Raise your hand. None. Okay? This is the David Clark School of Law, not the Bernie Madoff School of Law, I'm happy to say. But like all other businesses, there are transactions which go awry. Now, your classmates who aren't here at the Law Review Symposium today, who are studying to become commercial lawyers, are working on contracts that spell out all of the contingencies of a particular deal in great detail. When a dope dealer and his customer are negotiating, they are negotiating obliquely and in code. The one thing you don't want to be is to have a written memorandum of the details of the dope deal. That leads you to prison very fast. When you speak on the phone, you use code. Can you send me the shirts? The shirts? Yeah, send me the shirts. How many shirts? I want 3.5 shirts. Well, each shirt's a kilo, so send me 3.5 shirts. I mean, this kind of coded talk, of course, leads to misunderstanding. It leads to ambiguity. And of course, we're not talking about people necessarily honest to begin with. So, oh yeah, I'm going to send him the shirts, all right, and it's not 100% cocaine like he thought. It's 25% cocaine and 75% talcum powder. So you suddenly get your bum cocaine. You go down to the DC Superior Court and bring an action for the violation of some provision of the Uniform Commercial Code? You go seek your remedies at the Uniform Commercial Code? Of course not. You find out, I need a couple of guys with guns. Because I'm going to I'm going to sell this. I'm going to go down there and hold a gun to the guy or the guy's son until he brings me the money or brings me the dough. It is all of the conflict in what is a $65 billion a year industry has to be resolved by conflict, by violence. It's resolved by violence. So this entire industry depends upon violence as a way of determining. Now, if you're selling drugs at 9th and O Northwest, you take credit cards, checks a couple pieces of it, you take cash. You only take cash. Now, you know how other cash businesses in the District of Columbia are set up. They have a plexiglass screen, there's a security camera here, there's a buzzer to call, maybe there's an armed security guard from a private security agency. If you're a dope dealer, you don't get to call Whacking Hut or Wells Fargo. You don't have an off-duty police officer at your drug spot unless they're in some particular county in the country. You need Lefty and Paco, and they are crazy-ass killers. That's their reputation. You want people known for the use of violence. And so this kind of, do you want me to take this away? You want to change it? Thank you. So this is an industry that depends upon violence for its operation.
Mr. Sterling, can you just talk into it, that one? You need to speak a little closer.
Yeah, sure. I'll do my houses. Is that okay? I'll try to lean or squat. Stand on one leg. this does bring us then to the question of the economics here. According to a study done for the White House, I gave you the conclusion, $64 billion in illegal drugs in 2000, $35 billion a year spent on cocaine, $10 billion a year spent on heroin, $5.4 billion spent on methamphetamine. Now that's in $2,000. So drug use, you saw, is still relatively steady. We're probably, if we consider inflation, we're probably spending more. None of that is taxed. That's all tax-free. So the United States government is essentially subsidizing this activity about $25 billion per year. What about, what are comparable industries? Well, all sports franchises, football, baseball, basketball, hockey, in 2010, about $22 billion a year. Credit card issuing companies, you think about all the profits that all the credit card companies made. It's about $46 billion a year in 2010. Health clubs and gyms a year, they're all over the place. $24 billion a year. This is an enormous industry, employs hundreds of thousands of people. Globally, the United Nations estimates it's a $321 billion in revenue in 2003. That number makes no sense, but that is the United Nations Office on Drug Control speaking. I mean, it's hard to imagine that the rest of the world is spending, on the order of 4 times what we're spending on drugs, given the poverty that exists in the rest of the world. There isn't enough property to steal to pay for that in the rest of the world. The number doesn't make any sense to say it's almost as big as world petroleum sales. I mean, these are clearly people who are hallucinating when they describe numbers that scale. We're spending directly in law enforcement costs about $50 billion a year, state, local police, federal policing, courts, imprisonment. Since between 1989 and 2008, the population of federal prisoners on drug charges increased 400%. 20-year period, 1989 to 2008, population of federal prisoners increases 400%. Have we accomplished anything from this? The other kind of income problem is spelled out in a paper that I have out front called 11 Ways the War on Drugs is Hurting Your Business. If you think about how this crime affects business, shoplifting losses magnified across the economy, customers deterred from coming into a business, 8 million men and women who have felony drug convictions who are underemployed, unable to get credit, unable to buy a car made in the United States, unable to buy, without a credit card to get tickets to take their kid to see the Wizards or the Capitals. Think about all of the ways in which the economy is being hurt because we've economically castrated millions of people in this society. I would suggest that our economy is perhaps 1 or 2% depressed. So think for a moment, if your parents have some kind of investment or retirement fund, perhaps, they're invested in a union pension fund or something, think of that growing at a rate that it's 1 or 2% a year less than it could grow because of the implications of the war on drugs and its economic consequences. Let's talk for a moment about human rights, and I'm going to talk very differently about the usual frame, which is the frame of the tremendous racial discrimination that's intrinsic in this. I mean, the war on drugs is built on a legacy of racism. In my paper that I have out at the front desk called Drug Policy, A Challenge of Values, I argue that, it was because of racial attitudes that the war on drugs was developed. It is sustained, and each of its enlargements is about playing on racial fears, and that its role in American society now is to maintain white privilege. That is the role of the war on drugs. Because when you ask the American people, hey, is the war on drugs effective in keeping drugs out of the hands of my kids? No. Is the war on drugs saving people's lives? No. Is it preventing crime? No. So why are you in favor of it? Why is it so powerful? Why does it continue? Well, you look at it in historical terms. There's a detour for a moment. Very good paper by Al Blumstein in 1972, A Theory of the Stability of Punishment. And he looks at the rate of incarceration for a half century from 1920 to 1970, and it's at 110 per 100,000. And he says, gee, I guess punishment's pretty steady. He looks at some Norwegian studies and says, okay, there's another culture, completely different, steady rate of incarceration. I'm going to presume that, I'm going to conclude that societies punish at a sort of steady level. Now, at that moment, the ink is not even dry. When the paper's published, the rate of incarceration starts going up. I mean, it's as though there's an electric charge. The rate of incarceration is over 700 per 100,000 now, and still going up. So what is 1970? Why do we have a stability for a half century? Because 1970 is the conclusion, the successful conclusion of the civil rights movement. Because for that half century, up until Brown and the Voting Rights Act and the Civil Rights Act, up until then, segregation was lawful. And segregation was a punishment for this deviant status of being black in a white society. And that punishment is like being on parole today. You can't go to these schools. You can't associate with these people. You can't travel without reporting to your probation officer. Lawful segregation and parole are very similar in terms of the way they operate. And when that punishment is removed from the status of being black, at that point, the war kicks into being. At that point, Richard Nixon says to H.R. Haldeman in the White House, you know, this war on drugs that I'm declaring, it's all about the blacks, but I can't say it. And it is from that point on, so that now, when we talk about the drug problem, well, it's an urban problem. Code, it's black. We talk about youth at risk. Well, what's the thought balloon? Well, we're talking about black kids, Hispanic kids. White kids use cocaine at the rate that is 2 to 4 times the rate that black kids use. And you say to a white audience, your white kids are more at risk. Huh? What are you talking about? No, it's black kids. So there's now a synonym. If it used to be drugs and crime, it's drugs and black. Black and drugs. Black drug problem. So what's our image? Well, Channel 5 News tonight, the drug problem. So let's show some black people. This was especially the case after Len Bias died in 1986 when I was working at the House Judiciary Committee. And that's what, so why is it that a drug law like the crack cocaine mandatory minimums that's so patently disproportionately racial in its implication can't get addressed until we have a black attorney general and a black president of the United States, 25 years after it's enacted? How can it not be addressed until then? Because it was serving its purpose, which was to put a stamp of deviance on black people in a post-civil rights era. Now, in another human rights sense, drug users and a drug culture are part of our culture. When we think about popular music, popular culture, motion pictures, this is all been influenced by drug use, by positive drug use, by drug use experiences. It's no accident that musicians use drugs. So that we have pipes, posters, drug users engage in rituals. Now I'm talking more in the case of sort of marijuana users, LSD users, MDMA users, ecstasy users. I'm not talking, we could talk about heroin injectors and their own rituals. And they have their own subculture. But this is about a persecution of a subculture. And it is a violation of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Article 27 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights guarantees that everyone has the right freely to participate in the cultural life of the community. So, young people want to go to a rock show, let's have the cops out there pat them down and arrest those who are carrying drugs that they use at the rock show. Going to a festival, let's set up the state police and set up checkpoints and harass them on, bogus protectional stops. Article 27, Universal Declaration of Human Rights, to which the United States is a signatory and ratified in 1988. Everyone has the right to enjoy the arts and to share in scientific advancement and its benefits. If LSD is not a scientific advancement, what is? If MDMA is not a scientific advancement, what is? How can we say, oh no, those scientific advancements, well those are culturally used, those are used by a deviant subculture. But yet we are prepared to lock up 1 million such people year after year in the name of this. That's a violation of human rights. You have a right under Article 19 to the freedom of opinion and expression. This right includes freedom to hold opinions without interference and to seek, receive, and impart information and ideas through any media and regardless of frontiers. LSD is a medium. Marijuana is a medium. When people use drugs, they are using a media to directly influence their mind, to directly influence their emotions and their thought processes. You think, oh, it's okay to pick up some newspaper, because that's what they had back in the days of James Madison. But if you want to stimulate your neurotransmitters directly, no. Where does this come from? And it ends up then being used as a persecution of a subculture. Article 18, everyone has the right to freedom of thought. Well, how can you have a right to freedom of thought if Congress and the DEA say your own brain is off limits to you because you've got particular neurotransmitters and particular receptors in your brains that get you high? We know that there are structures in your brain that are in fact directly triggered only by THC, your body produces THC-like chemicals called anandamide. You've been hardwired by God to get stoned, and the government says, no, you can't. That is a violation of your human rights. And this is a violation of a culture. So, those people, myself included, who use drugs, beneficially, spiritually, socially, we have a right, and not only a right, we must be integrated into the society, in our system of drug control, so that drug users are welcomed in doctors' offices, they are welcomed in the schools, they're welcomed in the universities, they're welcomed in the law courts, they are welcomed in professional societies. So what does integrated drug control look like? Summers that I was in law school, I went to Villanova. I was not an associate down at Pepper, Hamilton, and Sheets. I didn't work for some law firm around Philadelphia or here in Washington. I led wilderness canoe trips in Maine. I was a licensed wilderness canoe trip leader by the state. My camp was insured, and I took kids into the woods to do very dangerous activities like start fires, chop down trees, split wood with axes, paddle canoes through rapids, and bring them out trained, happy, dirty, healthy. We should have licensed LSD trip leaders. You want to explore your mind and explore the spiritual aspects of psychedelic drugs? You ought to be able to find a licensed professional. Insured, member of the National Association, meets the professional requirements, professional ethics. Perhaps you have to, well, kid goes to summer camp, kid's got to have a physical. You want to take an LSD trip, you have to have a psychological examination. At least you're going to do it with me. You want to have an LSD trip, you want to make sure, how's your heart? How's your health? No, what we got now is insanity. You have illegal dealers passing out LSD, nobody knows exactly what it is. You get on the metro, you go down to the Verizon Center, and you say, ah, my God! How can we not imagine people are going to have disastrous reactions some of the time? We've set it up so people will be hurt. We have to integrate drug use into our society and bring the drug culture into a part of it so that it's safer. Heroin users, we need to talk about addiction management. People who are heroin users, who are going to get dope sick if they don't get heroin, they need to get it. They have a right to get it, and we have a duty to make sure that the heroin they get is not contaminated, that they can do it in a safe place, and that they're not patronizing organized crime, and that they don't have to rob somebody to pay for it, or shoplift, or prostitute themselves. So we're going to have addiction management agencies, staffed by addiction management specialists. There will be addiction management counselors, and then part of it was like, yes, you can use heroin, but how can we help stabilize your life? You still, how are you doing with your relationship with your wife or your kid's mother? How's that going? How's your housing situation going? Why do if you're a drug user, you have to get kicked out of your housing, kicked out of your public housing. This is insanity. It's insanity what we're doing because we are prepared to stigmatize drug users. Now we're all extremely aware of the nuclear-powered catastrophe that's taking place in Japan as we sit here this morning. Let me quote from last Wednesday's New York Times, last Wednesday's Washington Post, a terrific piece on Wednesday, March 15th titled, Radiation threat can take great psychological toll, experts say. Rob Stein writes, and I'm going to quote at length and conclude. Survivors of the bombings at Nagasaki and Hiroshima in 1945, Chernobyl and other nuclear accidents in Japan and Brazil were stigmatized by their societies, which caused discrimination that intensified emotional distress. Quote, after almost every radiological emergency, anyone or anything seen as or perceived as associated with the emergency came to be seen by others as tainted or something to be feared or even the object of discrimination, said Stephen Becker of the University of Alabama at Birmingham. Such stigmatization can interfere with victims receiving care and recovering from the events, said Becker, who studied the psychological and social impact of much less severe nuclear accident in 1999 at Tokemura, Japan. In that case, people in other parts of Japan refused to buy products from that region, and travelers were turned away from hotels and asked not to use public baths and swimming pools. Similar discrimination occurred after a 1987 radiation exposure event in Goiânia, Brazil. In the long run, such incidents can negatively transform entire cultures. In the areas affected by the 1986 Chernobyl accident, a crippling sense of hopelessness set in and was passed down through generations. Is it possible that the stigmatization around drug use has become part of what we see as the hopelessness and what we call the ghetto? Quoting Becker again, what we know from experience is the psychological footprint from a nuclear disaster can not only be massive, but in many ways greater than the effect of radiation, Becker said. On an individual level, these range all the way from anxiety disorders, depression, and substance abuse to a kind of culture of fatalism and hopelessness that has gripped the population in many areas, and it continues today, decades later. Radioactivity is the perfect way of thinking about drugs. People use drugs, they're radioactive. The subject, it's radioactive. Drug policy, in drug reform politics, it's radioactive. Well, I think that this is an outstanding opportunity today for us to talk about getting past this radioactivity and recognizing that perhaps drugs are about as dangerous as kryptonite. That is, it belongs in the comic books as a fear, as a danger. And that we're going to have to get over our fear of kryptonite and bring drug users into our society with the kinds of controls of the market and the expectations of responsible use and accountability that we expect of all citizens of the free society. Thank you.
Am I radioactive from that last talk? Cell phone use? Thank you very much, Mrs. Sterling. Effort, sometimes a futility. Make the sound system right. Thank you, Mr. Sterling, for those sterling remarks, pun intended. You called for the integration of drugs into our society. You gave me a new word, drug abuseologist, quote unquote. You talked about how drugs do not protect society, and indeed, the goal of our drug laws should be to save the lives of drug users. So you called for an international human right for drug users and for people who use drugs, citing the well-known Declaration on Human Rights.
Marvin, turn it off.
If you're recording it though, where's the microphone for your recording?
Recording?
Is this microphone what's feeding your recording?
No, that's
just for the sound system. There's a microphone here also.
Testing 1, 2, 3. Testing 1, 2, 3. Marvin, do you have another speaker?
No, it's there.
That's the only one. So it must sound like Marvin's speaker.
But the thing is we can hear you.
All right, I will continue with a loud voice. So to conclude, Mr. Sterling, you dropped a few stats on us too, such as our illegal drug industry amounts to $65 billion a year. And our federal prison drug changes increased by 400%. And we lock up about 1 million people, mainly on drug law. Now to bring an international comparative perspective to this, I'll ask Jordan Blair Woods to kindly come forward and share some of his doctoral research comparing the European system on the treatment of drug use, and to offer any kind of perspective on the United States policy on the war on drugs.
Thank you. Is this on or should I?
It should be on,
Okay.
but I don't know how much it's
I'll get it. Hold on.
amplifying your voice.
Thank you so much for giving me the opportunity to speak and present my research. I also want to apologize for bringing the rain last night with me to England, but I'm glad that it's finally cleared up. My article is on the recent implementation of drug decriminalization in Portugal and the lessons that the U.S. can take from that. The article doesn't necessarily argue the case for decriminalization in the United States, but rather argues that events in Portugal may cast further doubt over the sensibility and legitimacy of America's highly punitive policies towards drug use. In 2001, through legislation, Portugal became a trailblazer in the international community by decriminalizing the personal use of all illicit drugs. Personal drug use is now handled entirely as an administrative offense, rather than a matter of criminal justice. It's a matter of public health. A decade later, we're starting to see some results. And originally, I was actually going to place these results in the greater context of European drug policy, but then I realized that if I went on and on about Europe for the next 20 minutes, that there's still this lingering question of how any of this is relevant to the United States. And since I think the case for international perspectives hasn't exactly been made yet today, I want to start by briefly outlining the case for international perspectives in drug policy and why the United States should consider them. I then want to talk briefly about some of the pros and the cons of drug decriminalization. I'll then talk about Portugal in detail, and then conclude by explaining potential implications for U.S. drug policy. So I start with the case for considering international perspectives. And I think in the U.S. legal realm, although I would argue not so much in the social science realm, the call to look to the international community really leaves a bad taste in people's mouths. And I think there's usually this presumption that we're looking to international perspectives in order to show that something that we're doing at home is wrong. I want to take us, some may very well say that America's drug policies are wrong, but I want to take us beyond this because I think that there are more substantive reasons to consider international perspectives on drug policy. I see three categories of reasons for considering international perspectives, and I want to touch upon each of these briefly. The first are normative reasons, the second are evidence-based reasons, and the third are political reasons. So in terms of normative reasons, I think that considering international perspectives helps us to think about issues in terms of rights and justice. For instance, how do our conceptualizations of what a drug offense is compare with other nations? What types of drugs do we criminalize, and is that similar from other nations? Also, how do our penal and also our non-penal approaches and the justifications for those approaches compare with other nations? Now, I think that these broad questions aid us to put our policies into a wider context. We gain knowledge of which nations we share commonalities and which nations we differ from. Evidence-based reasons. Now, I think many would argue that US drug policies are not informed enough by empirical research, and that there's a great disjoint between policymakers and researchers. I think that international perspectives can help us to address the following issues. First, in terms of data collection, what type of statistics do other countries gather? What are their methods and methodologies? How are they used? Second, in terms of empirical evaluation, what approaches or programs are being implemented abroad? How are they evaluated? What are the methods of evaluation? What are the results? Now, I think that these questions can help us to either engage in comparative research ourselves, or they can help us to improve the methodologies and official statistics of research in the domestic realm. I think they also help to bridge the gap between lawmakers and researchers in the realm of drug policy. Political reasons. Finally, I think there's a general consensus that drug problems are transnational and that they bleed through national borders. And I think that the current situation about the drug cartels involving the United States and Mexico exemplifies this. Considering international perspectives opens the door to creating multinational solutions to transnational drug problems. It helps us to avoid undermining international coalitions on drug strategy and losing opportunities to work in conjunction with other nations to combat drug problems. Considering international perspectives also helps us to consider how our drug policies affect other nations' strategies and how their policies affect our strategies at home. The simple point is that considering international perspectives acknowledges that drug problems are not contained within a domestic bubble and that solutions may cause us to require or necessitate looking beyond domestic borders. Now, hopefully all of these reasons are persuasive reasons for the US to consider international perspectives on drug policy. I now want to move to some of the pros and cons of drug decriminalization. There are three legal approaches to addressing drug use. At one end of the spectrum is criminalization. Illegal drug use under criminalization is a crime, and individuals face criminal charges and proceedings if they're caught using drugs. I think at the other end of the spectrum is legalization, and under this approach, people are legally permitted to use drugs under regulated conditions without the threat of civil, criminal, or administrative sanctions. Now, in between these two extremes is decriminalization. Here, drug use is not a crime, but it may remain subject to non-criminal sanctions. Since decriminalization mostly takes a position only on drug use, drug production and drug distribution may still remain criminalized under a decriminalized regime. Now, governments can eliminate penalties for drug use in two ways. Under de jure decriminalization, laws are amended explicitly to eliminate criminal offenses for drug use, and I'm going to show how Portugal is an example of this. Under de facto discrimination, drug use is still prohibited formally under the criminal law, but law enforcement or prosecutors simply choose not to go forward with any drug use cases. Now, in the full article, I provide a summary of the pros and cons of each approach, but I want to focus here on decriminalization. Decriminalization proponents argue that the war on drugs has completely failed. They claim that criminal penalties further harm drug users and make it harder to assist them in overcoming addiction. They also argue that drug use criminalization wastes valuable resources on drug law enforcement, and that these resources could be better spent on programs that contain and that decrease the harms of drug use, such as treatment programs and legal exchange programs. Now, although decriminalization can be viewed as a reasonable middle ground between criminalization and legalization, some also view it as the worst of both worlds. Criminalization proponents argue that decriminalization will cause drug use to skyrocket because people will be free to use drugs without fear of any real criminal consequences or fear of punishment. Conversely, legalization advocates argue that criticize decriminalization because it perpetuates the harms of leading the production and distribution of drugs to the black market. There are also many implementation and enforcement concerns. Drug users may consistently ignore administrative sanctions with no tangible consequences. And furthermore, decriminalized regimes very much depend on the police officers and law enforcement to issue administrative citations to drug users. In practice, officers may not issue citations because they feel that it's more appropriate to focus their efforts on actual crime. Now, this skeletal overview of the pros and cons of decriminalization will hopefully provide a greater context of thinking about the following discussion of drug decriminalization in Portugal, which I'll move to now. The movement to decriminalize drug use in Portugal can be traced back to the country's struggle to tackle a wave of drug-related problems in the 1980s and the 1990s. During this period, illicit drug use, predominantly heroin, rose dramatically. The damaging consequences of rising drug use became more visible in society as drug crime increased, public health worsened, and fear of social instability escalated. Now, faced with the potential drug epidemic, the Portuguese government created an expert committee, the Commission for National Drug Strategy, called CNDS, to evaluate Portugal's national drug policies. In '98, the CNDS released an influential report that called for Portugal to adopt a harm reduction strategy and to separate drug users entirely from the criminal justice system. The decriminalization of drugs for personal use was one of the specific recommendations of the report. According to the CNDS, subjecting drug users to criminal proceedings had not provided an adequate nor an effective response to drug use or the country's drug problems. Now, the Portuguese government approved the CNDS almost in its entirety, and formed its national drug strategy based on its recommendations. Law 30-2000, which is a specific law that decriminalizes drug use, stems directly from this strategy. So how decriminalization works in practice. Law 30-2000 mandates that each of the 18 administrative districts in Portugal create and maintain at least one commission for the dissuasion of drug use, or called CDT. A person caught using illicit drugs faces a CDT rather than a criminal court. Each CDT is comprised of 3 members, 2 representatives from the medical and social service sector, so this could be physicians, psychologists, psychiatrists, or social workers, and 1 representative from the legal sector. Police officers cannot make criminal arrests for personal drug use, but they maintain a very important role in the regime. When officers encounter a person who is using or possessing drugs, the officers should confiscate the drugs and issue an administrative citation. The cited drug user then has 72 hours to appear before the appropriate CDT. The CDT's first task is to determine whether a person is a drug user or a drug trafficker. The amount of drugs confiscated from the person at the time that the citation is issued is key. The law only permits users to carry 10 days worth of a drug. If an individual carries more, then the CDT will refer the person to criminal court where charges commence for drug trafficking. Now, for drug users, the CDT will discuss the circumstances of the case and decide whether the user is a recreational or a dependent drug user. Now, since the main goals of the decriminalized regime are to dissuade drug use and to encourage drug-dependent users into treatment, the type of sanctions that the CDT will impose depend on this judgment. When imposing sanctions, the law guides the CDTs to consider numerous criteria, such as the severity of the offense, the type of drug used, whether the use is in public or in private, whether the use is occasional or habitual, and the user's personal and economic circumstances. The CDTs have a wide variety of sanctions at their disposal, including monetary fines, warnings, suspensions of licenses for professions or activities, bans from specific places, bans from interacting with specific people, restriction on travel, requirement to report regularly to the Commission, ban on possessing handguns, seizure of personal possessions, and cessation of subsidies or allowances from public agencies. Now, the CDTs cannot mandate treatment, but they have the discretion to impose sanctions in combinations in ways that they see fit to prevent users from using drugs in the future. The CDTs can suspend and terminate sanctions if 1, dependent drug users enter a complete treatment, and 2, if recreational drug users fulfill other agreed upon conditions, such as the promise not to reoffend or use drugs in the future. The CDTs can reinstitute sanctions at any time if these conditions are broken. The Portuguese model's success and shortcomings. So, although researchers have uncovered many challenges, they have generally found that the regime is a success. So I want to outline some of the topics and some of the research on these topics. So, drug use prevalence. Lack of national data on drug use in Portugal makes it somewhat difficult to measure decriminalization's influence on drug use. Before decriminalization, there were no general population surveys on drug use. These surveys began in 2001 after decriminalization began. Surveys were conducted, however, on drug use prevalence among secondary school students. Now, the data that is available do not suggest that drug use has skyrocketed after decriminalization. Drug use seems to have slightly increased within certain subgroups and declined within others. Between 2001 and 2007, lifetime and past year use slightly increased among adults for almost all illicit substances. Conversely, lifetime usage rates slightly declined for teenagers. And these trends were also consistent with the trends in Italy and Spain. So this may suggest that changes in Portuguese drug use may be attributable to regional trends. However, there is one very significant trend that may be attributable to decriminalization. After Portugal decriminalized drug use in 2001, the prevalence of problematic drug use specifically, and in particular intravenous drug use, declined. This trend is inconsistent with the trends in Italy or Spain where problematic drug use increased. Now, this dissimilarity may suggest that decriminalization can reduce the most harmful forms of drug use. Health-related harms. In 1999, just before decriminalization, Portugal had the highest number of drug-related AIDS cases in the EU and the second highest prevalence of HIV among drug-infected users. The number of drug-related AIDS cases was also increasing, even though the number was decreasing in France, Spain, and Italy. Now, after decriminalization, incidence of HIV and AIDS among drug users declined substantially in Portugal. The number of trapped cases of hepatitis C and B in treatment centers also declined, despite the fact that many more drug users were seeking treatment after decriminalization took effect. Now, drug-related mortality has also declined after decriminalization. During the 1990s, the number of drug-related deaths multiplied tenfold. But between 1999 and 2003, there was a significant drop in drug-related deaths. Drug policy experts credit this decline to the increasing number of heroin users who entered substitution treatment programs after decriminalization took effect. Now, since decriminalization, there's been a significant increase in the number of drug-dependent users who have sought treatment. The number of people in drug substitution treatment programs specifically increased from 6,049 in 1999 to 14,877 in 2003. More people also entered detoxification, therapeutic communities, and halfway houses during the period. Third, crime. Now, decriminalization's influence on drug-related crime trends is a bit difficult to measure because statistics on drug-related crime are not regularly connected in Portugal. However, in 2004, the main Portuguese police branch that handles drug crime investigations released a report concluding that crimes strongly linked to drugs, so those were theft, robberies, public assaults, and certain types of fraud, increased by 9% between the periods of 1995 and 1999 to 2000 and 2004. So those are interval periods of 5 years. The report, however, didn't attribute this increase to decriminalization. It also did not consider that officers may have more time and resources in the decriminalized regime to focus their efforts on boosting the reporting of other drug-related crimes. Drug supply. Between 1997 and 2008, the number of drug seizure operations remained relatively steady. However, the quantity of seized drugs increased by approximately 500%. So this increase may suggest that decriminalization has enabled law enforcement to refocus their supply reduction efforts on large-scale operations rather than street-level deals involving small levels of quantities of drugs. It may also suggest, however, that there's an increasing supply of drugs in Portugal. Data also suggests that drug prices have declined in Portugal since decriminalization. More detailed studies are needed to determine whether the declining prices are due to decreased drug demand, which would be good, or increased drug supply, which is bad. Experts have interpreted existing data on student drug use to suggest that prices have declined due to lower drug demand, but more research is going to be needed to determine that. Now, some experts have argued that decriminalization has posed obstacles to law enforcement's drug supply effort. They contend that since drug use is no longer a crime, the police can't bargain with arrested drug users to gather information on other drug users and other suppliers. Conversely, some argue that police have adapted under the regime and that drug supply efforts have actually improved through using new channels of information sources, such as the international community. So those views are mixed. Burdens on the criminal justice system. Decriminalization seems to have taken some pressure off of the criminal justice system. In 2000, about 14,000 people were arrested for drug-related crime. This number dropped to about 5,000 per year after decriminalization. Furthermore, the number of administrative citations for drug use has remained constant at about 6,000 per year. So this seems to suggest that there hasn't been a large surge in contact between drug users and the police after decriminalization. Now, during the 4 years prior to and the 4 years after decriminalization, drug trafficking charges increased by 11%. Some experts believe that this reflects law enforcement's increased ability to focus on drug trafficking crimes, but it also may reflect an overall increase in drug trafficking in Portugal. Now, since decriminalization, the proportion of prisoners sentenced for drug-related offenses has declined from 44% in 1999 to 28% in 2005, which is when the latest statistics were available. This decline has contributed to a decrease in prison overcrowding, which was a serious problem in Portugal when decriminalization actually took effect. Implementation issues. Now, research suggests that some police officers have welcomed the regime and view it as a more effective approach to addressing drug addiction. Research has also found that some officers view citations as futile and simply don't issue them because they believe that users can ignore them. But despite this enforcement issue, there's a rapid increase in the number, or there was a rapid increase in the number of drug users who enter treatment programs in the decriminalized regime. Now, this increase may suggest that the range of sanctions available to the CDTs is effective, and it also may suggest that more users are willing to enter drug treatment programs because they no longer fear the stigma of criminal sanctions. Some experts have identified some poor relationships between CDTs and local service providers, which has frustrated the ability of some drug users to obtain treatment. Some experts also contend that CDTs are too bureaucratic and inefficient, and there's a general sense that the government is investing less and less in decriminalization over time, which could undercut its effectiveness. And so this all shows the importance of actually providing resources and the infrastructure for maintaining decriminalized regimes. I want to now talk about possible lessons that drug decriminalization can have, in Portugal, can have for here in the United States. From these results, I would argue that there are at least 5 valuable lessons. Now, these lessons don't necessarily say that the United States should run to decriminalize drugs, but I think it does provide new insight on how we think about our current drug policies, especially in light of their punitive nature. I discuss these lessons in more detail in the article, but I'll briefly outline these 5 lessons here. I think the first lesson is that Portugal has moved de jure decriminalization from an abstraction to a reality. I think Portugal is the first solid example of a functioning de jure criminalized regime, and the case illustrates that it's possible for a nation to abandon its criminal laws by legislation and implement another legal approach. Now, in fairness, there are many more obstacles to implementing decriminalization in the United States. Federalism frustrates the ability to adopt decriminalization in the United States through one sweeping piece of legislation. And I would argue that even though this is the case, I think that the Portuguese experience may create more of an impetus, possibly at the state level, to at least explore and to see what alternative legal approaches to drug use can provide. And I think this is especially appealing on the state level, since it seems that most arrests for drug use occur at the state level as opposed to drug trafficking, which seems to be more of a federal issue. The second lesson is that there are potential benefits to decriminalizing all illicit drugs. Now, most of the dialogue on drug decriminalization and legalization in the United States focuses on marijuana and cannabis. Now, I think that this could be rationalized by the fact that cannabis is one of the most commonly used illicit drugs in the United States, and some perceive it to be as the least harmful. Now, Portugal illustrates that decriminalization may have the potential to reduce the harms of problematic drug use, particularly involving heroin, cocaine, and amphetamines. Now, these drugs, especially when taken intravenously, pose serious risks to public health and safety. So what this means is that the case of Portugal really sheds light into the direction of the dialogue on decriminalization and legislation, and the possibility of expanding it beyond marijuana to other forms of drugs. The third lesson, I think, is that social attitudes towards drug users play a very important role in the success of newly enacted drug laws. Now, the Portuguese legislature did not force a decriminalized regime upon Portuguese society. Rather, harm reduction principles were already somewhat embodied in Portuguese politics and society. Political and social attitudes towards drug use are important because they very much influence the social stigma that's attached to drug use and to drug addiction. Now, experts believe that more drug use accepted treatment after decriminalization in Portugal because there was less of a social stigma attached to drug use and drug treatment because it was separated entirely from the criminal justice system. Social stigma currently deters many drug users from seeking treatment in the United States. For instance, in the 2009 National Survey on Drug Use and Health, this reported that 8.5% of drug users did not receive drug treatment, despite admitting to the fact that they needed it, because they felt that receiving treatment would cause their neighbors or community members to have a negative opinion of them. Therefore, changes in social attitudes, and not just changes in legislation, are necessary if the federal or state governments choose to decriminalize or legalize drugs and make this a success. I think the fourth lesson is that there's a great amount of preparation and investment that's required for a decriminalized regime or any other new sort of approach to function. It took over a year for the Portuguese government to create CDTs within each administrative district and to train and to recruit members to serve on them. The government also increased resources for drug treatment to ensure that drug users who were referred to CDTs had access to the treatment during the administrative process. It was also necessary for the government to communicate with law enforcement and local service providers about their new roles in the new regime. Therefore, the formal elimination of criminal penalties for drug use was really only one step that made the Portuguese government, that made decriminalization a success in Portugal. Finally, there are potential benefits to treating drug use strictly as an administrative offense, which I would argue may be a reason to reconsider the current approach of U.S. drug courts. Drug courts are specially designed courts that place nonviolent drug offenders into drug treatment programs after they've been arrested for drug use. Drug offenders are rewarded for continuing treatment, and if they complete treatment successfully, their charges and their convictions must be expunged. But if offenders do not complete treatment, then the courts may punish offenders with graduated sanctions, which could ultimately lead to incarceration. Now, some experts have praised drug court programs, but other experts suggest that recreational drug users are actually the ones most likely to succeed in the drug court program, whereas drug addicts who are genuinely addicted are the ones who are most likely to fail. By not meeting the conditions of drug courts, genuine addicts receive regularly punitive sentences that are harsher than the sentences that they may have received if they simply accepted a criminal plea at the beginning of the case. Offenders also never escape the stigma of criminal proceedings and are excluded from the public benefit programs and many employment opportunities because of their drug use convictions. Now, Portuguese experts attribute drug treatment issues, or increases, and problematic drug use declines to the fact that there's a lower social stigma of addressing drug use through the administrative rather than the criminal realm. And I think the case of Portugal thus invites critical discussion on whether drug use should be handled as an administrative matter entirely, even when drug addicts fail to complete treatment. And that's a discussion that I think is open for debate. I'll stop here and leave the floor open for questions.
Thank you very much for that comparative analysis from Mr. Woods, who's studying over in the UK. I think we have a few minutes for a few questions before we transition into the lunch period. So I'll take the questions by show of hands. Question for any or all candidates? Try to keep your question brief. Who would like to ask the first question? I just want to test that it's not in the microphone. If you turn the microphone off, you still hear the distortion.
You turn the speaker back on.
This is a question over there.
Yes, go right ahead. Can you disable that speaker? Yes, go ahead, sir.
My question is for Mr. Sealing. You said the main goal of drug policy should be to save the lives of drug users. What about the goal of preventing drug use in the first place? Should that be taken into account?
Did everyone hear the question?
Yes, I'll repeat it. The questioner said that Mr. Sealing said the purpose of drug laws should be to save the lives of users. And he asked, what about the goal of preventing abuse of drug use in the first place?
I think that goal of preventing use is a worthwhile objective for families and for churches and for people for whom their values are not to use drugs. But it's akin to saying, should we have a government policy discouraging sexual behavior or particular kinds of sexual behavior? Because implicit in the question is that certain kinds of drug use should be discouraged, but not others. Implicit in that is that the category of currently illegal drugs should be discouraged, but doesn't necessarily include, let's say, tobacco or alcohol. Should it assume for a moment that it's okay to have that as a public health goal, as the way we are concerned about living more healthily in general. It's appropriate in that context. But to think that we're going to use the criminal law, I mean, we're not at a point in our society we're going to prosecute people who sell cigarettes to adults. We're not going to prosecute people who smoke cigarettes. We don't think about the criminal law as a tool for discouraging, what is a very, very dangerous activity. So when we talk about this, I think, again, it's a question of sort of what part of policy we're talking about. And I guess the difficulty that your question brought for me is I reflexively thought of it in terms of the criminal justice matrix, which dominates the whole we were thinking about. Assume that we were talking 10 years from now, and we're only talking in the context of education and health. And you said, well, should we be doing more to discourage use? It's quite possible that we'd all say, yeah, well, that's part of what we're trying to do. Because in that context, it's appropriate. That's all.
Like sex, is there any safe use of drugs?
Of course there is. Most drug use is safe.
Next question. All right, you say.
Yes, I wonder if you'll help
A little louder, please.
Please help me to tease out the illegal use of prescription drugs, because that's a tremendous problem in our society that we can't overlook as we focus on harm reduction efforts.
The student asked the question, what's the distinction between the illegal use of street drugs from the abuse and illegal use of prescription drugs? Anyone want to take that on the panel? Go ahead, sir.
You're correct that there's an extremely serious problem right now, and that the dramatic increase in overdose deaths that I pointed to in many respects reflects increasing overdose deaths around the use of prescription narcotics in particular. And I think that the thing that you want to in part look at is to recognize that people are using drugs like narcotic drugs when they have untreated other kinds of conditions, untreated mental health issues, untreated sexual assault issues, untreated post-traumatic stress disorder. So that and so the people are numbing their feelings of shame, they're numbing their distress by the use of these very, very powerful drugs. And these drugs have can affect the central nervous system, they can suppress respiration. They are very risky. And I think that our tendency is to look at these in isolation and recognize that this in part is a failure to deal with other kinds of social problems. This is in part a measure of how hard it is to get mental health care in this country. It's easier if you're mentally ill in this country to buy a gun like Jared Lochner than it is to get into a good mental health program because of the stigma we have around mental health. And these, I think, are factors that go into that. That's only a partial, I guess, attempt to explain.
I'll take your question in the middle and I'll go back to you.
As far as prescription drugs go, I'm presenting on that 3 o'clock. So I've dealt a lot with that. I'm a deputy commonwealth attorney out of Wise County, Virginia. And, you know, you showed the 7 deaths per year in 2007. My county had 60. County next to us had 62 per 100,000. It's a massive problem. And going back to something you said earlier, Mr. Sterling, you know, you talked about how someone over here asked whether problem, well, isn't kind of part of the problem that we have certain things that really aren't all that harmful illegalized, marijuana, maybe LSD, whatever, and then we have other things that are very harmful that are illegalized, and they all get lumped in together, and that causes most of the well, not most, but a lot of the problems we have. I mean, if we move forward, personally, I'm not a big believer in the medical marijuana, but I don't think marijuana should be illegal. But I'm not a big believer in the medical use of it. If we move forward in those kind of sections, wouldn't we be able to then concentrate on the more serious problems?
I think that your insight that lumping a whole bunch of different kinds of drugs with different effects and different use patterns together undermines our ability to sort of make credible statements about them to the audiences we want to reach in order to discourage the kinds of use that are the most risky and to provide safe interventions. Students for Sensible Drug Policy on various college campuses around the country have a program they call Good Samaritan Policy, where if a student passes out or is having some kind of a drug overdose, they can call the health services or call for an ambulance and get help, knowing, well, this isn't going to trigger then a disciplinary action, get them kicked out of the university or expelled from the dormitory. So that when we have these very broad kinds of criminalized, stigmatized approaches, even where somebody wants to provide help, they're prevented from doing so. And so the kinds of communities where prescription drug use, for example, is so great, we have inconsistent messages. If a kid has been told marijuana is going to kill you, tries marijuana, finds it doesn't kill you, the message that OxyContin will kill you has a whole lot less credibility.
Mr. Brooks, you commented on your research that Portugal in their decriminalization criminalized all drugs, right?
So going on to even thinking about the way that you just asked the question, focusing on marijuana first and then dealing with these other drugs, I think that what the case of Portugal and what's going on in some other countries in Europe shows is that if we deconstruct the fact that we're lumping all of these drugs together and we start thinking about drugs individually, I think it's harmful to kind of say what are the least quote-unquote harmful drugs that we think, put those under legalization or decriminalization models, and then keep the quote-unquote more harmful drugs that we think about, whether that's cocaine, whether that's heroin, that's going to depend, I guess, on social contacts, and then leaving those in the criminal realm. I think that if we're going to kind of take apart that lump, then what we need to do is not just focus on, I guess if you want to say, how we're viewing them in terms of the degree of harm that they might cause the person, but also in terms of interventions, what is going to be the most effective way for them, I guess, to stop using that drug, because that's what stops that harm. I think that now what we're seeing is, well, if I think that heroin or cocaine is the most serious, then that's going to remain in the criminal realm. But it might be that even if we view them as the most serious in terms of individual consequences, that decriminalization or therapeutic intervention programs are more effective strategies to getting them to stop than criminal or more penal approaches. So I think that, yeah, it's right. It's like lumping these all together, I think, frustrates the debate, but I think there's also harms or real consequences if we take apart that lump the wrong way.
In the latter part of the questions, I understand it say that if you do single out a few of the less harmful drugs and criminalize them or legalize them, it leaves attention to concentrate on more harmful drugs.
Right, but then what type, I mean, when you say it leads attention to, what does that attention mean? Does that mean that we're dealing with this through a more punitive way? Does it mean that we're going to have more attention to deal with this through specific interventions? Does it mean that, so I guess that's where we have to go, so what does that actually mean when we're putting more attention to it? Because I can easily see that, for instance, we decriminalize the quote-unquote least harmful drugs, and that means people think that law enforcement resources and maybe prison resources are focused on more quote-unquote serious drugs, and that we're not taken out of that, I guess, penal approach, if you want to talk about, if that's how you want to kind of conceptualize that. So I think it's the way that that extra energy is invested.
Right.
Yes, okay, you want to talk? Yes.
Oh, yeah, no, I was just going to say, I agree, because that's exactly what's happening in California. There's so much focus on marijuana that once it does become fully legalized, it seems as if it's going to end there. I don't necessarily see legalizing marijuana as a stepping stone to other drugs. There's a major attempt to separate marijuana because of all these medicinal benefits. And I think that that can be harmful in the greater goal.
I think you are drawing an important observation about the politics of the drug policy reform movement.
Yeah, go ahead.
Because I would say that one of the risks of kind of thinking about drugs independently, so drug by drug, is that we might miss, and this goes into your last point, we might miss what the underlying principles of our approaches to dealing with drugs are in the first place. So I think if you look at what happened in Portugal, they decriminalized all drugs because their approach to drug use in general was based on a harm reduction model. And I think that if we go drug by drug, how does going drug by drug influence the general, I guess, values underlying our approaches to dealing with drugs? Are we only approaching drug X through a harm reduction model, drug Y through more penal approaches, and why? And I think that some could argue that really fragments, I guess, the direction and the messages that general drug policies are going to send the public and going to send people. So I think there are real risks maybe to going about it drug by drug.
I think we have time for 2 more questions before we break for lunch in the next section. You were first, and then I'll recognize you second again.
Thank you. We heard a lot about the racial and economic bias of the war on drugs, and Ms. Mascagni, you talked about the fact that both the proponents and beneficiaries of the medical model in California are white and middle class and others. Is that
Yeah, and that's definitely dominating the debate.
And then you talked about 2012 and furtherance of legalization. But is there support in the communities that are most negatively affected by the war on drugs to organize themselves or through other organizations to work on passage of legalization in order to negate those effects?
Yeah, I mean, that's the irony. There actually is. Leading up to Prop 19, the California chapter of the NAACP endorsed Prop 19. LULAC, the biggest civil rights organization devoted to Latinos in this country, endorsed Prop 19, right? But then at the conferences that I'm attending, I've attended 2 now, just in the past couple months, it's still mostly white people in the room. Right, and at one conference, Ms. Small with Break the Chain spoke. This eloquent presentation, she was very subtle in critiquing the self-interest in the room, right, and how racial justice has been marginalized. And I thought it was just so profound, and that she got this huge applause, right? But in the rest of the conference, no one's really talking about racial justice. And I'm still not seeing this movement to push, inequalities based on, racial and ethnic differences into the debate.
What about, it's been my experience, and just a quick follow-up, sorry, in the local communities that, these are organized around faith organizations typically, the African American community especially is organized around the faith community. What has been the faith community's response in California?
Yeah, I think that's an excellent question. The media loves to point out.
Just to repeat, the questioner asked, what's been the response to essentially the black church and the faith community to this issue of the disproportionality of our drug laws with an impact upon people of color?
There was one Bishop Allen who was very vocal in New York Times, and the media is loving to show him speaking out against legalization, right? It's going to harm black communities, encourage drug use, right? But you also have a lot of leaders within both Latino and Black organizations pushing for legalization because of the harmful effects of the prison industrial complex. And at the last conference I was at, there was supposed to be a member from a Black church speaking, and they weren't there. Also, apparently, like a person from the NAACP was supposed to be there. I'm asking these questions, well, why aren't they here? So that's, I think, the greater goal, right, in the next year to bring in.
I'll add quickly that the president of the NAACP Conference of California endorsed the medical marijuana initiative.
Was it marijuana legalization?
Legalization,
Yeah.
excuse me. And she was rebuked by the National and forced to basically retract because the National could not decide what was the oldest and the largest Black civil rights organization position on legalization of marijuana. Last question.
Yeah, my question is, if you accept that the goal is to legalize all drugs more broadly than just marijuana, do you think in our American political dynamic it's a helpful first step or neutral or negative to just go for the legalization of marijuana?
The question was, is it helpful for the political discourse to call for the legalization of all drugs, or just start with marijuana first?
I do think that it's important to stop making this distinction between marijuana and other drugs. The DPA has continually said that we need to be putting this money into drug rehabilitation programs, health programs, instead of incarcerating people. And it's as simple as that. Of course, the issue is much more complicated, but it's simple for me in that way, right? Because prescription drugs, of course, like Vicodin, or how different is that from heroin, for example, right? Or we know that ecstasy can be prescribed for psychiatric conditions. So I think it's very limited to just keep the debate on marijuana.
Well, thank you very much for that wonderful presentation. Please join me in thanking Mr. Sterling.